So moving along, we've looked so about halfway through now. Continuing on, kind of as we go through the stories, continuing on sort of through Israel's history here, and continuing on with our stories. So this week we're looking at the story in 1 Samuel, where the ark ends up in Philistine territory. And so we kind of want to look at the story and what's going on here. So again, we're going to start here with reading this. So again, it's about 2 chapters in the middle or in the beginning, early part of 1 Samuel here, where the story occurs. So again, we're picking this up sort of in process. We'll talk about the context after we read it here, but we'll start with the story. So the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they took the ark of God and brought it into the temple of Dagon, where they set it down beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod got up the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen down on with his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they got up early in the morning on the following day, once again there was Dagon, fallen down with his face to the ground, face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. The head and the hands of Dagon had been cut off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body was left to him. For this reason, still to this day, the priests of Dagon and all those entering the temple of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod. And the hand of the Lord was heavy toward the people of Ashdod, and he devastated them. He struck Ashdod and its territories with tumors. When the men of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, "The ark of the God of Israel must not dwell with us, because his hand is harshly against us and against Dagon our God." So they called together all the princes of the Philistines and asked, "What should we do with the ark of the God of Israel?" And they replied, "Let the ark of the God of Israel be taken to Gath." So they took the ark of the God of Israel there. But after they had taken it there, the hand of the Lord was against that city as well, bringing a very great panic. He struck the men of the city, from the least to the greatest, so that tumors broke out on them. So they sent the ark of the God on to Ekron. But when the ark of God came to Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out at the sight of it, saying, "They have brought us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us and our people." Then they called together the princes of the Philistines and said, "Send away the ark of the God of Israel. Let it go back to its place, so it will not kill us and our people." For the panic of death was in the city. The hand of God was very heavy there. For the men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city for help rose up to the heavens. Now the ark of the Lord was in the territory of the Philistines for 7 months. The Philistines called for the priests and the diviners, saying, "What should we do for the ark of the God? What should we do for the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we should send it back to its place." So they said, "If you are sending away the ark of the God of Israel, you must not send it away without a gift. Rather, you must be sure to send it back to him with a guilt offering. Then you'll be healed, and it will be revealed to you why his hand will not leave you." Then they asked him, "What is the guilt offering that we should send back to him?" And they replied, 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, according to the number of the princes of the Philistines, because the same plague is on both you and your princes. You will make images of your tumors and images of your rats, which are ruining the land, and you will give glory to the God of Israel. Perhaps he will make his hand that is upon you and upon your gods and upon your land lighter. Why do you harden your hearts, just as Egypt and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? When he made a fool of them, did they not let them go free and they left? So now, get a new wagon and prepare it, and get 2 nursing cows that have never been yoked. You will yoke the cows to the wagon, but their calves you will take away from them and put in the pen. Then you will take the ark of the Lord and put it in the wagon, and into the saddlebags beside it you will put the objects of gold which you are sending him as a guilt offering. Then you will let it go free, and it will leave. Then you will watch. If it goes up to Beth-Shemesh by the way of its own territory, he himself has done this great harm to us. But if not, you will know that his hand has not touched us. What has happened is merely a chance occurrence." So that is what the men did. They took the 2 nursing cows and yoked them to the wagon, but their calves they kept back in the pen. And they put the ark of the Lord in the wagon, along with the saddlebag and the rats of gold and the images of their tumors. Then the cows went straight on the road toward Beth-Shemesh. They walked steadfastly on the one highway without deviating in any direction, and they were lowing as they went. The princes of the Philistines followed them as far as the border of Beth-Shemesh. Now the people of Beth-Shemesh were reaping the wheat harvest in the valley, and when they looked up and saw the ark, they rejoiced at the sight. The wagon came to the field of Joshua of Bethshemesh and stopped there at a place where there was a large stone. So they broke up the wood of the wagon, and they offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. The Levites had taken down the ark of the Lord along with the saddlebag that was with it, and which were the objects of gold, and they set it on the large stone. And the men of Bethshemesh offered burnt offerings and slaughtered sacrifices to the Lord on that day. Meanwhile, the 5 princes of the Philistines saw all this, and then they returned to Ekron that same day. These are the gold tumors which the Philistines sent back as a guilt offering to the Lord. For Ashdod 1, for Gaza 1, for Ashkelon 1, for Gath 1, for Ekron 1. There was many gold rats, as there were cities of the Philistines belonging to the 5 princes, including both fortified cities and unwalled villages of the open country. The large stone in which they sent the ark of the Lord is still to this day in the field of Joshua of Bethshemesh. But the Lord struck down some of the men of Bethshemesh because they looked into the ark of the Lord. Among the people, he struck down 70 men. Then the people observed mourning rites because the Lord had dealt a severe blow to the people. As a result, the men of Bethshemesh said, "Who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? And where can we send him away from us?" So they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath Jearim, saying, "The Philistines have restored the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it away with you." So the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took charge of the ark of the Lord. They brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill and consecrated Eleazar, his son, to guard the ark of the Lord. So again, we have this story where the Philistines have captured the ark, and so they've got it in Philistine territory. So again, starting with the context, what is the context? Again, we're sort of picking the story up sort of midstream. What's happened right before this? Why did the Philistines have the ark?
Israelites had gone to war with Philistines and things weren't going well, so they had the ark of the covenant brought to help them win the battle.
Okay. Good, right? So good. So right before this, in chapter 4, the Israelites are fighting with the Philistines, and they lose a battle, and they think, well, if we bring the ark with us, then that will bring God with it, and then we'll win. And they were treating the ark like it was a sort of magic object, and that if they had the ark there, that would mean automatic victory. And so they brought the ark, and they still lost, and the Philistines walked away with the Ark of the Covenant. In its broader context, this is still the period of the judges. So in the beginning of 1 Samuel, right, the second part of Samuel deals with the period of the kingship, eventually kind of get to the person of Samuel. But really in this period where we're talking, this is still the period of the judges, and which is not one of Israel's greatest periods of history, right? There was a lot of conflict, a lot of up and down. And if you read the book of Judges, right, it's a very cyclical book, up and down kind of book. And during this time, sort of, you get to the end of the book of Judges, you read about Israel being oppressed by the Philistines. So you have Samson, who's during this time. You have Eli during this time. You have Samuel during this time. And it's really not until you start getting into Saul and really David that they're able to completely deal with the problems that the Philistines were causing them. And so that's why they're having this battle, is because they're having these issues with the Philistines. The Philistines are kind of oppressing them, so that's why they're fighting them. And not only did Israel lose the ark, but 2 of Eli's sons, who was sort of the judge, the ruler, sort of kind of leader at this time, 2 of Eli's sons, who weren't great guys, but they were priests, and they had taken the ark with them. They died in the battle, and Eli hears the news, and he falls down and dies. So it's just kind of this very catastrophic situation. Israel's lost the ark, and they've lost their leaders. I mean, it's just all around bad news. And not only that, right? It's just so bad that Phinehas's wife, she's giving birth, and she calls her son Ichabod. The glory is departed, no glory, right? Just so bad that all of our glory is gone. Just this very bleak thing. So as we get into this story, there's a sort of situation of what I would call contrasting moods, right? There's this contrast between where the Philistines are feeling and what the Israelites are feeling when the story starts. So at the beginning of this, when we start in chapter 5, the Philistines are on the top of the world. They just won this victory. They just captured this very important war trophy. They just captured the symbol of Israel's God, right? they're on top of the world, right? For them, things are great. On the other hand, you got Israel sort of on the bottom of the world. They just lost the ark. They just lost Eli, right? This is sort of one of the darker periods in Israelite history because they've lost. They're kind of without leaders, without the ark, right? They're really hurting at this point. You got the situation when we start chapter 5 in the story of these sort of contrasting moods, where Philistines are on the top of the world, Israel's on the sort of the bottom of the world. Philistines are in great shape. Israel's really hurting here. And so what they do is they take their ark and they put it in the temple of Dagon, right? Their god. Why do they do that? What's the motive for putting the ark in Dagon's temple?
Our God's greater than your God.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's a symbol of the fact that Dagon apparently defeated Israel's God, because that's how they, in the ancient world, if you won a battle, that was a projection of sort of the strength of your gods, right? So if I beat you in battle, that means that my God is stronger than your God. That's how I was able to win. And so by putting the ark in Dagon's temple, it's sort of this just tribute to him. It's an acknowledgement of his superiority, apparently, to the God of Israel. It's a tribute to him. It's, hey, you helped us win, so here's this war trophy for you. And they put it next to Dagon, sort of indicating that Israel's God's going to do homage to him, right? So I'm going to bring Israel's God in here to you. He's going to do homage to you because you're obviously the superior God because you beat him in battle. So they think Dagon is superior. They're going to bring Israel's God in, let him pay homage to Dagon. Right? So you lost, you can come and pay homage to our God, who's obviously greater than you are. And so again, right, this is sort of this very bleak moment in the story where again, not only they've lost, it looks like Israel's God is inferior. I mean, it's just, from an Israelite perspective, things are really, really bad at this point. This is sort of the low point of the story where the world's coming to an end. Everything seems horrible, right? Just disaster. Just very quickly, Dagon was just a little historical who this Dagon person is. Dagon was a Canaanite deity that apparently the Philistines adopted. It was not something, the Philistines were probably a people that came out of maybe like Crete or Greece. They're sort of a European people that settled in along the coast of Israel, Palestine. But Dagon was a Canaanite deity. You can read about him in sort of Ugaritic, which is sort of up in sort of Turkey area nowadays, in northern Palestine. You can read Ugaritic texts that talk about Dagon. He was apparently a Canaanite deity that the Philistines sort of adopted as their chief deity when they settled in. And a lot of those Ugaritic Canaanite texts, they talk about Dagon as the father of Baal, who we're familiar with from a lot of other, reading of Old Testament history. We talked a little bit about Baal last week. Dagon's kind of seen as often perceived as being Baal's father. There was initially, it was thought that maybe Dagon was a fish god, which is why, if you can sort of see the picture down there, that's why they've used that picture. And it's the best one I could find for this. But more recently, they think he was probably more like, sort of kind of like Baal, a weather storm god, a fertility god. Specifically, they identify him with the idea of vegetation and crops, because his name, Dagon, is related to a word in Ugaritic in Canaanite for grain. And so I think it may have been some sort of a grain vegetation kind of a god. But he's again a Canaanite deity, again associated with Baal in the Canaanite pantheon, and so that's this Dagon whose temple they brought the ark to. All right, so again, beginning of chapter 5, everything's terrible. Israel's in the bottom of the world, Philistines in the top of the world. Israel's God looks like he's been defeated. Everything is awful. And you get to verse 2 of the chapter, and everything changes. right? There's this complete 180 in the situation, right? Dagon does his face plant twice, right? Because obviously the Philistines didn't get the meaning the first time. Okay? So here you have the opposite. So they brought the ark in so that so our God can do homage, or so that Israel's God can do homage to our God, to Dagon. And God flips it by having Dagon fall on his face. So it's actually Dagon who's the one doing homage, right? So even though it's in Dagon's temple in foreign territory, God is still demonstrating his superiority. Dagon's still the one who's doing homage to him. That's the way it should be perceived by the Philistines, right? That Dagon is the one doing homage, and that Israel's God is superior, right? It's the opposite of what the Philistines believe is the case. Just because they won the battle, right? They think that Dagon's superior, God is showing, nope, that's not really the case after all. What's interesting is I think I've included that in the translation that I have in the handout there. The idea, it actually uses a participle, the falling down, so this continuing action, not like they just fell over, but there's this idea that it's an intentional sort of action on his part of falling down in front of God. And this is the idea of, again, of homage and worship and acknowledging Israel's God's superiority. So the author is very careful in the words he uses here to indicate what he's trying to communicate is going on here with this situation. It's not just some sort of accident. It wasn't some random breeze that blew him over. There's this idea this is an intentional action on the part of Dagon. Okay, and there's an idol. Then the second time, we have the situation. So he falls down. The Philistines put him back in his place. And he falls down. He's falling down the next day. And apparently, if you read one of the commentaries I was reading, said that, the second time they get up early in the morning. It's like they're a little worried about what's going to happen. So they get up really early just to see what the situation is the next day. And the next day it's even worse, right? Because now he doesn't even have any head and hands anymore. Right. So the second time they're cut off and lying off by themselves. What's significant, again, in the reading here is that the head and the hands aren't broken off. They're cut off. What is significant about being cut off?
There's a difference between a clean cut and a jagged cut.
Okay.
Like any kind of forensics, you look at the break line, and if it's a clean cut, somebody sabotaged it, and if it's ragged, then it just falls apart.
Okay, good. So again, it indicates that there was something intentional going on here, that it wasn't he just fell over and in the process of falling over, things broke off. There's some sort of extra action that's significant here. Okay. What else is significant about cutting off the head and hands?
Assume somebody did it.
Okay, assume somebody did it. So the idea of the intentionality, good. That there's somebody who's done this. Again, it's not an accident. Okay, we'll get to the right. It's on the threshold. But when David defeated Goliath, what did he do? Cut off his head. Right? When the Philistines found Saul after they beat him at the end of 1 Samuel, what did they do? They cut off his head. Okay. Right. So here's that at the end of 1 Samuel in chapter 31. Right. So this is the battle of Philistines fighting Saul. He dies. They find him. They cut off his head, stripped him of his gear, and they broadcast the news that they had won. Right. The idea of having his head and hands cut off is, in one part, the idea of intentionality. It wasn't an accident. That there was some intentional action here on the part of somebody to do this. But also, there's the idea of not only is Dagon doing homage, but he is a defeated enemy. That's how you treated people who were defeated enemies, as you cut off their head. Something the Philistines should have been that was one of the cultural things. So the Philistines should have perfectly understood the significance of this because they did this themselves. They should have understand what this meant. Okay. So not only is God superior to Dagon, but also here he is in Dagon's house. He's just defeated him. Dagon is a defeated enemy, right? The Philistines think they've won, that Israel's God is defeated. God is flipping the script. No, actually, I'm defeating you. Your God is the one who's defeated. So he goes to Dagon's house and he beats him, essentially. He defeats Dagon in Dagon's own home. He goes on the road to hostile territory and defeats the enemy god. All right, so again, not only is Israel's God superior, but he has defeated the God that they thought had defeated Israel's God. It's actually the other way around. God is demonstrating very clearly to the Philistines who the superior God is, who's defeating who is subject to who. And it's not Dagon who's doing the winning here. Right. So they thought, again, they're thinking, after their victory that Dagon is the victorious God. Actually, he's a defeated one. Right? Again, flipping the script, giving the Philistines the exact opposite of what they think is going on here. And again, this is something they should have understood. When they see this within their cultural understanding, they should have been completely aware of what this meant. The significance should not have been lost on them. In some ways, it sort of was. We'll talk about as we go along here, but they should have known that they were in. It was bad news for them. So we have this contrast between that's set up between Israel's God and the Philistines' God, between the Lord and between Dagon. And so one of these contrasts is you have a God who's helpless versus this God who is not helpless, capable. Right? I don't know exactly what the perfect antonym of helpless is. Unhelp. Anyway, so again, here's one of those indications that's in the text, that's sort of highlighted here, of the helplessness of Dagon. He falls over. He can't even get back up again. He's got to get his people to come and put him back in his place. Right? That emphasizes his helplessness. Right? Whereas, in contrast to that, God's going around wreaking havoc in the land of the Philistines. Okay? God is perfectly capable. Right? He needs no help. Israel just lost a battle. God goes to Philistines' territory and wins, is beating the crap out of them all by himself. Right? He doesn't need any help. Right? He is perfectly capable of doing this on his own, whereas Dagon needs his own followers to help set him back up again. So this very, again, the powerfulness of God or the capability of God versus the helplessness of Dagon. Again, this idea of Israel's God and his power versus the powerlessness of Dagon. So Israel's God is able to go into foreign territory and defeat the Philistines, devastate them, give them all kinds of problems. And Dagon can't do jack squat about it. Right? If Dagon's supposed to be there protecting his people, helping them out, and he's just helpless. He can't do anything about Israel's God. Right? Israel's God's wreaking havoc on his land, and he can't do anything. Right? Which is emphasizing again his helplessness, his powerlessness, his incapability. The third one is again part of the humor of this passage, and I think something that the author is intentionally drawing out here. Right? Is a contrast between a God who is handless and a God who is a handful. Okay. 8 times in chapters 5 and 6, 8 times the word hand appears. The author keeps talking about hands. Okay. And so we read the idea of the hand is the idea of power, typically the idea of power and ability. So if, we talk about the hand of the Lord, right? It's its action, its ability, its power, the ability to do stuff. Right. So frequently, again, repeatedly, most of the times that the hand appears, it's in dealing with Israel's God, the Lord. So his hand is powerful, it's wreaking havoc, it's heavy, it's harsh. And it's the idea of this hand for the Philistines, it's this weighty, oppressive sort of thing, right? It's causing them problems. Again, the power of God. So you could say again, from the Philistines' perspective, Israel's God is a handful, right? He's too much for them to bear. In contrast to this, what doesn't Dagon have anymore? His hands, right? So again, the author's setting up this ironical contrast between God, who with his hand, who's acting and exercising his power among the Philistines, and Dagon, who doesn't have his hands anymore. He can't do anything, right? He's been stripped of his power. By taking off his hands, He's been stripped of his ability to act, right? Assuming he even had any to begin with. He doesn't have his hands anymore. He doesn't have the ability to act anymore without his hands. So this contrast again between Israel's God and the Philistines' God. That the author, we talked some last week about sort of the contrasts between the pagan ideas and the true ideas. Right here again is this contrast that the author is setting up between sort of the false beliefs of the Philistines and their Canaanite God, their Canaanite deity, and his worthlessness, and the absolute dominating ability of Israel's God, even in foreign territory. And again, in losing his hands, he doesn't have any power, right? By being handless, he's powerless. One of the ironies of this, if you go back to chapter 4, one of the ironies is that when the Philistines learned that the ark was coming into the camp of Israel, they panicked because they had some understanding. They didn't know perfectly, but they had some understanding of what happened with Egypt. They had some understanding of who this God is and what he had done. And so they heard the ark is coming, they panicked, which is part of the reason they're probably on the top of the world in chapter 5, because, hey, we actually beat this God. Hey, we're in great shape. Little did they know what they really had. Right? But what's interesting is that back in chapter 4, they're afraid of this God, and they're asking, who will rescue us from the hand of this mighty God? And these mighty gods are thinking they're pluralistic Canaanite terms. But who will rescue us from the hand of this God? They were afraid of the hand of this God, and they wanted deliverance from this hand. And yet, by capturing the ark and bringing it into Philistine territory, they have invited on themselves the very hand that they were afraid of. Right? They didn't want this hand on them, but by bringing the ark into the Philistine territory, they have brought on themselves the very hand that they were afraid of. And of course, Dagon, because he's he's handless, he can't rescue them. Right? They wanted, who's going to rescue us? Well, it isn't going to be Dagon. Right? He doesn't even have any hands or a head. Right? He's useless. Right. And again, this idea that of you see this in chapter 5, you see this in chapter 6, the idea that it's not only the people who are suffering, but they even make the mention of the idea that Dagon is suffering too, that their own gods are at the mercy here. So they even acknowledge, right? One of the other ironies here is they even acknowledge the inadequacy, the impotence of their own gods, that their gods aren't adequate to deal with Israel's God. Right? They even recognize the insufficiency of Dagon and their own gods. And so there's just, again, this one of the ironies, one of the humorous aspects of this story is this play on words by the author and all this play on words with the idea of hand and with the Philistines, their own handless God versus Israel's God with his powerful hand. This hand they were trying to avoid, that they then just brought on themselves anyway. So then we had this interesting aspect where after, right, Dagon does the face plants, then it talks about what happens to the people, right? So then all the stuff with God's hand, that he's bringing this sort of punishment on the people are suffering. And so they kind of play hot potato with the ark, right? Nobody wants it. Okay. So it goes to Ashdod. Probably Ashdod, because the reason it goes to Ashdod is that's probably the place where it seems that there were at least two temples of Dagon in Philistine territory. One was in Ashdod. I think the other was in Gaza. I think you read about that with the Samson story. But Ashdod is the one that's probably closest to where the battle was that they had captured the ark. So that's probably why they took it there, is because it's the nearest one. So it goes to Ashdod, and again, their Dagon falls in his face, and then they start to suffer, right? So they say, we got to get this thing out of here. And the Philistine rulers say, well, we'll just take it to Gath. So it goes to Gath, and they suffer, right? Doesn't change the situation, and it just means that more people are suffering, right? So they say, we need to get rid of it from Gath. So they send it on to Ekron, where they also suffer. So the Philistines, in their continued infinite wisdom here, have proceeded to manage to wreck the entire land by moving the ark around. So not only is one city wiped out, they're managing to wipe out their whole territory. All right. So again, they're single-handedly what Israel was completely unable to do in 2 battles. The Ark of God is doing by itself, just walking around Israelite Philistine territory, just mutilating all of its people, right? So and the Philistines are even helping this out by moving the Ark around, right? By helping basically defeating themselves in this process. There's thought that what is happening to the people, what they're suffering from, is the bubonic plague. One of those plagues that devastated Europe in like the 1400s. Very, very devastating. The reason for the tumors that it talks about may be like what they call the buboes, these sort of swellings that occur as a result of the bubonic plague. It also mentions rats, and rats tend to carry the fleas that spread the bubonic plague. So that's one of the thoughts. There are other things. They may also think it could be dysentery. There are different kinds of diseases. But bubonic plague is one of the possibilities of one of the things that they are suffering from, because it is a very devastating kind of disease, at least certainly back then. And so that may be what they're dealing with here, is the bubonic plague. But whatever, I mean, they are getting ravaged. I mean, God is devastating the Philistines. And again, they're sort of doing this to themselves by just taking the ark around. Just a little map here. Here's Ashdod, again up here, sort of northern part of Judah, just south of Dan. So then it moves on to Gath, right, and then it moves on to Ekron. So it's kind of doing this circle here, going around and trying to move it from place to place, trying to find somewhere for it to go, because one place doesn't want it. We'll talk about that in a moment. Right? But they keep moving it around, hoping that they can find some place to let it settle. Okay? And all they're doing is devastating themselves. So the people are almost out of their minds, right? If you read this, it talks about great panic, great terror. I mean, these people are scared out of their gourds at this point, right? With what's going on. I mean, they know what's happening. You read the comments of the part of Ekron. They see it coming, and they're like, "What are you doing, bringing that here?" Right? You just killed us all, right? I mean, they don't even need the ark to get into town before the news is already spread, right? They know what's coming, and they don't want any part of it. Okay? So the people are understanding that the ark is the source of the suffering. They recognize that the presence of the ark is bad news for them. They want it gone. Nobody wants it. You sort of translate it, if you want to model it, to sort of paraphrasing from a line from the movie Hunt for October. The people are kind of saying to the leaders, "You idiots, you've killed us, right? What are you doing to us?" Right? They recognize that they're doomed by having the ark come to them. So why do the Philistine rulers just keep moving the ark around? What are they doing? Why do they do this?
They don't want to give it back.
They don't want to give it back. This is their war trophy, right? They really don't want to give it back. They're also part of it's a test. Right? They want to verify that it's really the ark that's doing this and not just some random event. So, hey, we're gonna follow the scientific method here. We're gonna try it in this place, see what happens. We'll try it in this place and see what happens. Okay. So the people understand. The leaders seem to be a little bit slower to acknowledge or accept that the ark is really the source of the suffering. So they're going to move it around and test it. People seem to understand. This is where the people seem to be a little smarter than their leaders, right? But again, they're reluctant to give up their hard-won war trophy. I mean, they just want a battle. This is a big deal to have control of the ark. They don't want to give it back, right? So part of it, again, Israel's their enemy. So they kind of know this. They may have understood the significance of the ark to Israel. You don't want to give it back to these defeated enemies, right? This is important to them. Well, I don't want them to have it. Right? I want to keep it. I wanted them to continue to feel humiliated and defeated. I don't want to give them their important religious object back. The ark also sort of was this idea of the representation of Israel's God, and they may have felt like as long as they were holding it, they would continue to hold him captive. That we've got control over him as long as we've got the ark. Okay, now circumstances were telling them otherwise. Okay, that they obviously did not have Israel's God under control, but they may have thought that, right? Because human beings aren't always very smart. We tend to believe things regardless of what our eyes are telling us. So they didn't want to let the ark go, right? That they wanted to keep control of the ark, wanted to keep control of Israel's God, didn't want Israel to get its special religious object back. Right. So again, this idea of pride, ego, leaders never suffer from that, or any other human beings. Again, this idea we talked about some last couple of weeks, talking about now pagan thinking, right? That they're thinking in pagan terms, that to have control of the ark is to have control of Israel's God. Even if, again, circumstances tell them otherwise, that's how they think, right? And the reality is with human beings, when we develop sort of a particular way of thinking, it's hard to change that, right? It's hard to break out of the mold of thinking which we are used to running in. And so regardless of what circumstances are telling them, they're probably still thinking, hey, we've got the ark, we've got control of Israel's God. And so we have this element of their hard-heartedness and stubbornness on the part of the Philistine leaders, that they just don't want to let the ark go. And it even talks about that in chapter 6. The religious experts come to them and say, stop being so hard-hearted. That's what Pharaoh was, and it didn't do him any good. Right? It's not doing you any good either. So again, we kind of see the element of the hard-heartedness here. If you look at the beginning of chapter 6, they hold the ark for 7 months. 7 months it's been doing this to them. And they haven't gotten rid of it yet. Again, the hard-heartedness, the unwillingness to believe, the unwillingness to recognize what it's doing. And sort of that unwillingness to really, again, it kind of demonstrates how little concern they really have for the lives of their people, that their control of the ark is more important than the lives of their people. People are dying, the people recognize it's the ark, but the Philistine leaders keep control of it because they don't want to let it go. And so you see the consequences of pride, of hard-heartedness, especially again when that's on the part of leaders, the damage that can do to their people, when they're unwilling to recognize reality and its consequences and persist in their own channel of operation. Right? And we see that some in our own day, right? And the consequences of leaders who can persist in a particular way of thinking, regardless of reality, regardless of the consequences, that they're concerned, they're obsessed with the idea that this is the way to do it, so we're going to do it this way, right? Again, that sort of inability to get beyond the belief system with which they're engaged. And again, it's true of all human beings, but it's especially dangerous when our leaders are like that because of the consequences it has for such a large number of people. And the Philistines felt that firsthand. So while we're on the idea of the Philistines and the leaders and their pride, again, one of the fun things, there's some really fun literary elements to this story and things that the author is doing. And one of the fun elements is this word that shows up a few times in the story, which is the Hebrew word kavod, which sort of in its verb form means to be heavy, or to weigh heavily, to be weighty. It could be the idea of being honored, could be the idea of making dull or insensitive, which is the idea of hardening. And so this word appears with the idea of God's hand being heavy on the Philistines. So this is where this verb occurs. So God's hand being heavy, it's oppressive. It's this weight that's suffocating to the Philistines. So that word is used there. It also appears in verse in 6:6, where it talks about the Philistines hardening their hearts. So they're basically making their own hearts heavy. They're hardening them. They're making them insensitive. And the same thing is used with Pharaoh, right? The same is when Pharaoh hardens his heart. It's the same idea there. The noun form, because typically a lot of the nouns come out of verbal roots in Hebrew. The noun form kavod, which means glory. So often this is what we translate the glory of God is kavod. So his weightiness, his heaviness, with the idea of being honored. This is what appears in 6:5, where the Philistine religious experts say to leaders, give glory to God, acknowledge, honor him, give him credit, respect him. And so we have these three parts, these three sections, three different appearances of the word, sort of slightly different connotations, slightly different meanings. And so you kind of have this thing going on by the author, kind of playing on this word. So because the Philistines' rulers' hearts were kavod, because they were hard, God had to make his hand kavod, had to make it heavy on the Philistines so that they would give him kavod, so they would give him glory. Right? So it's kind of doing this word play in what's going on with the Philistines. Another way you could say it is what the religious leaders tell the Philistine rulers is that if you want the kavod, the heaviness of God's hand, to be lifted, you have to give up the kavod of your heart, the hardness of your heart, and give kavod to God, give God glory. And so you could sort of see that there's this kavod battle going on between the kavod of God's hand, God's heaviness, and the kavod of the Philistines' hearts, and sort of whose kavod can outmatch the other one, right? And in the battle of kavods, God won, right? His hand was too heavy and sort of outlasted the hardness of the hearts of the Philistines and the Philistine rulers. So again, some fun literary elements of this passage, things that the author's kind of playing with, that if you can see, you can kind of grasp some of the humor and what he's trying to do here in this story. But the hardness of the hearts versus the heaviness of God's hand. So really again, we've kind of talked about this idea already, but basically what's going on here is that God's sort of his own fifth column in Philistine territory, right? He's kind of gone behind enemy lines, and then he's beating the snot out of the Philistines in their own territory. Okay, so kind of constituting his own fifth column. So again, first he defeats Dagon. He goes to Dagon's temple and defeats him, cuts his head off, cuts his hands off. And then once he's kind of defeated the Philistines' protector, he can go on and beat the snot out of the Philistines, defeat the Philistines. Which made me think, which maybe you're familiar with, this passage out of the Gospels, which appears in a couple of the Gospels, this idea that, which Jesus says, you can't go into a strong man's house and take his possessions until you've defeated the strong man. Right? That's kind of what's happened here, right? God sort of defeats Dagon, the strong man, if you will, and then he can defeat all of his possessions, his people. Right? So there's sort of a sequence where God beats Dagon, and then he goes through and beats the people. So he's kind of, but again, he's giving this defeat to the Philistines, which his own people couldn't do. And again, they're helping him out by just taking the ark all over the place. All right, so again, this should be a lesson to Israel, that instead of trying to manipulate God, again, thinking in pagan terms, hey, we bring the ark here, we can win automatically, right? They're trying to treat God in pagan terms. Instead of like trying to think of me that way, you just trust, just let me do my thing, and you can win. So this, in some ways, if the Israelites are watching what's going on, they should recognize that God is perfectly capable of delivering them if they rely on him properly. And so here, again, at the beginning of the chapter, it looks like this horrible defeat. We've lost the ark. We've lost our religious leaders. Everything is terrible. And God turns that around and turns it into a resounding victory on his part and a resounding defeat for the Philistines. Okay. And so there's this irony, again, more irony here, that the Philistines brought the ark to themselves thinking it was a symbol of victory, and it turned into a symbol of their own defeat and devastation and humiliation. Right? What they thought it was going to be was not what it turned out to be for them. Right? Turned out to be very bad news as far as they were concerned. So, Philistine leaders finally have had enough. And they're like, we got to get this thing out of here, right? The Philistine leaders finally agree that it's time to send this home. Okay. And so they consult their religious experts. It says in there, it talks about the diviners. That's the plural of the same word that was used in a singular form that was used of Balaam that we talked about in the previous right? So this, again, this pagan sort of religious person, again, people who are prohibited in Israel, but most of the pagan nations around them would appeal to. So these were the Philistines, religious experts. What do we do with this ark? And they recommend a guilt offering and a test, right? They say, well, send it back with some stuff. Don't send it back empty-handed. Send it back with some stuff. And we're going to conduct a test just to make sure, as if having the ark devastating you wasn't enough. We're going to send it back just to make sure it really was Israel's God that was doing this, not some fluke. Okay. The idea of a guilt offering. A guilt offering, you read about that in the Mosaic Law. You read about that in the early part of Leviticus, where it gives some of the instructions about the guilt offering. But the guilt offering wasn't unique to Israel. A lot of the stuff that you read about in the Mosaic Law isn't there because it's unique to Israel. What's unique is the spin that God gives on it. As he tells his people, you're going to do it this way, right? The pagans had their own way of doing these things, but I want you to do it this way, in this fashion. And so guilt offering wasn't necessarily unique. If you kind of look at the Mosaic Law, it gives you some idea of the basics of around a guilt offering, which a lot of those other societies would have had, which is the idea of making some sort of reparation or compensation when you have an offense against some sort of sacred object, which the ark would have been. That's the way it is in the Mosaic Law. Is if you commit typically it's sort of these unintentional sins with regards to the Lord's holy things. There also is sometimes the aspect of people stealing something, and what you do is you make reparation. So if you steal something, you give it back, and you give some extra. You basically pay interest on it as a repayment for having stolen it. If you make some crime against the Lord's holy things, you make some sort of restitution with offerings and that kind of thing as well. And then it makes atonement for the guilty person. The idea is that then whatever they might have been suffering, whatever concern they have about potentially suffering from their crime is taken away. In this case, for the Philistines, they hope that they'll get healed. The devastations on their land will go away with the ark. But their idea of the guilt offering is not too unlike what you see in the Mosaic Law of we've committed this crime apparently against some sort of sacred object. We need to make reparation as we send it back. And so then they have this test. So the setup is that they get some cows that have never been yoked, right? So they get cows that shouldn't know what to do. They've been right. They're going to hitch them to this wagon, but they've never been yoked. So theoretically, they yoke them up and they shouldn't have no idea. It's like, okay, what's this? What am I doing, right? So they're untrained, and they have calves, which means their primary concern is for the calves, right? So wherever you want me to go, I don't really care. I want to go wherever my calves are. Okay. So they take these cows whose only motivation is to go back to their calves and not to go anywhere else. And they hitch them to a wagon and they say, we're going to watch what happens, right? And if the wagon goes to Israelite territory, we know it was Israel's God. And if it doesn't, then we know it was somebody. We need to do a better job of inspecting ships when they come in for the rats. Okay. We need a better health inspector. Okay. But the idea was to set up a sign that would be unmistakable. If this goes to Israelite territory, there'll be no doubt as to what's going to happen. Okay. So again, the cows should have no idea what to do. If they go anywhere, it should be back towards their calves. So this should be, again, they set up a sign that's meant to be unmistakable. We will clearly know what's going to happen after this occurs. All right, so what happens is the cows go straight on the road to Beth Shemesh, right? And there's a sort of threefold emphasis as to what they do. Okay. Right. So the author, again, the idea of threefold is this emphasis. The author is massively emphasizing to the reader or listener that these cows made a beeline. They went straight to Israel territory, no deviations, no wandering, no pit stops, right? They're not getting off on the exits, the highway for gas or lunch or anything. They're going straight to Israelite territory. Okay. There's no doubt, should leave no doubt in the minds of the Philistines or any person hearing the story as to what the result of this sign was. Okay. It is perfectly clear that this was due to Israel's God doing this. Right. So they go straight on the road, right? There's no meandering. There's the idea of this walking steadfastly on the one highway. They're going diligently on the one route that there is. and there's no deviations. The text literally says they don't turn to the right or to the left. They don't sort of, oh, that looks like a nice patch of grass. Let's go over there and grab a snack, right? Nothing distracts them, no deviations. They just go beeline, straight forward to Israelite territory. Just barrel on straight ahead. So again, there's this idea, again, that's doing this because of God's divine direction. So he divinely walks them along. He also divinely stops them, right? They get to this field of Bethshemesh and they just stop, right? So this divine direction to their movements, both in going and in stopping. So again, the idea was that the test should be absolutely, positively unmistakable. Right? The Philistines should have absolutely no doubt in their minds that what has happened to them is because of Israel's God. Right? Not only is the land like completely devastated, right? But now they've had again this very unmistakable. They set up the sign, and here was the options, and it is chosen option A, which is that Israel's God has done this to us. They should have no doubt in their minds as to what's happened. So if they thought this was a chance occurrence, any idea of that should be completely banished from their minds. There should be no doubt that this was not just some random thing, which is probably good for the job security of their health inspector. It's not his fault. So we get to the end of the story. And once again, we have contrasting moods between the Philistines and Israel, but now they're completely flipped. Right? They're the complete opposite of what they were when the story began. Now it's the Philistines who are down in the dumps because their land is devastated and they had to give back their religious war trophy. And it's the Israelites that are on the top of the world because they just got the ark back. And if they're watching their news, they know that the Philistines have just gotten devastated. Right? Their hated enemy who's oppressing them has just gotten wiped out. So again, we have this contrast, right, between the two. But now at the end of the story, or near the end of the story, it's exactly the opposite it was at the beginning. So again, in the meantime, God is flipping the script. He's taking this defeat, turning it into a victory. Israel gets its ark back. Now for Israel, things are great. Now for the Philistines, they're wondering what on earth just hit them. But that's not the end of the story. There's a little bit more at the end. Right, where there were some people in Bethshemesh who got a little too curious. That, ooh, the ark, I wonder what's inside. And that's not a good idea. So a number of them pay the penalty, right? Again, curiosity killed the cat here, literally. God is a righteous God, right? You don't mess with his stuff, right? He gave clear instructions about the ark. This is not something for the average man to play around with. It's not just a fun little curiosity that you can. It's not a museum piece. And so the people who thought it would be fun to look inside paid the penalty. Now you may see in your text, depends on how your Bible's translated. It may say 50,070. The 50,000 is thought to be some sort of scribal textual error, transcription error. The way that one of the commentaries I read said that the way the 50,000 is attached is not the normal way in which numbers are put together in the Hebrew. So they think that somehow, some way, it just got added on somewhere. Because for 50,000 people to have died in Bethshemesh, which was probably like a small farming town, I mean, that would have probably had to have meant that they had, couple 100,000 people in that city, in that place at least, and that would be an enormous place for Israel, especially at this time. I mean, Cincinnati has what, 400,000, about 300,000 people in the main part of the city in and of itself. So, but Bethshemesh is probably like this little farming community. So the 50,000 is probably a transcription error. It's probably more like the 70. So the plague, it's bad. People are dying, but it's probably not 50,000. It's probably not quite that bad, but there's still a penalty. Okay, again, the ark was to be treated with reverence. The Philistines learned that mistake, right? It's not, again, a museum piece that you treat without curiosity. Ooh, that's cool. Right? Just watch Raiders of the Lost Ark. Right? See what happens. So there's some irony here, that here we have the Israelites in Beth Shemesh, and they suffer very similar kinds of consequences that the Philistines just suffered, right? They did not treat the ark any better really than the Philistines, and they paid the penalty too. Right? The Philistines had the ark, messed around with it, they suffered. People of Israel, people of Beth Shemesh, they messed around with the ark, they suffer too. Again, God is in his holy objects to be treated with reverence and respect, not carelessly. The Philistines and the Israelites found that out the hard way. And the other irony is the people of Beth Shemesh react exactly the same way the Philistines did. Get this thing out of here. Right? This thing is death to us. We don't want to have this thing around. Get this thing out of here. Its presence is too dangerous, right? I kind of modified the translation here of chapter 6, verse 21, and they updated it to sort of more modern kinds of language. So they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath Jearim saying, good news, the Philistines have returned the ark. Now get down here and get it away from us. Right? Come down here and take it away. We don't want it. That it's dangerous. Again, there's this irony that the same thing happens to some extent to these Israelites as happened to the Philistines because they didn't treat the ark properly as well. Right? The lesson of this is, again, the power of God, and it will affect his own people as well as the pagans if they don't respect it properly. You just don't you have to be careful in understanding the reverence that God deserves. One of the other really fascinating literary elements of this story is the connection the author makes between what's going on with the ark and the idea of the Exodus from Egypt. So throughout this passage, you see all kinds of Exodus language and Exodus analogies. So I've because I knew I'd be running short of time, I've provided, if you look at the handout, I've kind of listed all those out there for you. There's a few that I want to go, we're just going to run through this quickly and focus on a few of them a little bit more as we go along. So it begins, if you go back to 1 Samuel, that's where it begins. Again, the Philistines acknowledge that this is a God who did something to the Egyptians, right? There's this connection with the Exodus back in 1 Samuel when it refers to the Egyptians and they're getting, again, their understanding seems a little bit off because they talk about the plagues in the wilderness. So again, some time's gone by. Sometimes, you've ever played the was it telephone game where you talk to one person and pass it along. By the time it gets to the last person, it's not quite the same. That's kind of probably what's happened here. That something's been a little bit lost in translation, transcription. Okay, but still, back in chapter 4 is where the idea of the connection with Egypt and the Exodus begins. Again, the capture of the ark sort of brings it into captivity or bondage, kind of like what we saw. Again, they put it in the temple of Dagon. I mean, you're the servant of Dagon now, right? You're Dagon's slave. The idea of the plagues, and even there's a word that appears in chapter 6, which is the same as a word that appears in Exodus. Now, most of the time, the term plagues is a different word, but there is a word that appears here in chapter 6 of this passage that also appears in the Exodus story back in Exodus 9:14. The idea of the plagues. So again, the idea of the land of the Philistines gets devastated just like the land of Egypt, right? Again, consequences about holding what they weren't supposed to hold, right? Let my people go. They kept them back, and so they suffered. Let my ark go. Well, we want to hold on to it, and so they suffered. You also see hand imagery within the Exodus story. So it talks about, you frequently see the terminology of God redeeming Israel with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. That kind of terminology repeats frequently. Actually, that appears kind of throughout the entire Old Testament. That when talking about the Exodus, God's redemption of his people with a mighty hand. There's a hand imagery. And then also when it talks about the plagues in the Exodus story, it talks about bringing his hand down on Egypt. So very similar kind of terminology with a heavy hand that he put on the Philistines. There's a similar sort of idea of a heavy hand on the Egyptians when he devastates them with the plagues. Again, plagues as a judgment not only in the people, but also in the people's gods. So within the Egypt story, the plagues were sort of a judgment on their gods. Hey, your gods can't do anything to stop me. And a judgment on their different types of gods. Same thing here. Dagon, you can't stop me. I'm going to do whatever I want, and you're powerless. And even people even talk about that his hand is heavy on us and on our gods. The gods are suffering as well. In chapter 6, it talks about the Philistine rulers were also suffering from what was going on, just like Pharaoh and his officials tended to suffer from those plagues. So it's not just on the people, but on the leadership. Right? Again, helping to help motivate them to act. If they're suffering too, maybe they're more likely to do something. Again, one of the other connections is the idea of the hardness of the heart. So again, Pharaoh hardened his heart, had to eventually give in. The Philistine rulers hardened their hearts. Again, the religious experts make this comparison, right? Don't harden your hearts like Pharaoh did. He made a fool of Pharaoh and his people, and they had to let the Israelites go. It's time for you guys to give up. Give in. Let them go. So again, and again, here's where, again, the religious experts even make this connection between what's going on in Philistia and what happened in Egypt. Hardness of the heart. Yeah, there's the verse 6 there. The idea of sending away or let go. So frequently within this passage, it talks about send the ark away or let it go. This is exactly the same word that appears throughout the Exodus narrative of let my people go. Let the Israelites go. Send the Israelites away. Same exact word is so. Again, the idea of letting the ark go is almost identical to the idea of letting the Israelites go. Let them free. Let them get it. Let them out of here. You have this again. It's used by the people, the rulers, the religious experts. All talk in terms of of letting go. What's fascinating is the Israelite, again, the Philistines people make this plea, send it away. Apparently months before the political leaders were willing to do it, right? The people of Ekron, like, get this thing out of here. Let it go back to its place. It's very similar to the pleas by the officials of Pharaoh, and also the people were making pleas to Pharaoh. Let this thing go. The land is getting devastated. Just let the people go. And Pharaoh, with his hard heart, says, no, I'm gonna hold on to it. Similar idea here. People are pleading, let the ark go. And the Philistine leaders are like, no, we want to hold on to it. The idea of leaving empty-handed. Again, the ark was not, don't send it back empty-handed. This is exactly the same word that's used in the Exodus story when the Israelites, when God tells Pharaoh, or God tells Moses, when the Israelites leave, they're not going to leave empty-handed. Have people ask their neighbors, and you're going to loot the Egyptians when you leave. And so again, this idea of empty-handed, again, exact same idea appears here in this story as appears in the Exodus story. Okay. What's ironic is, again, the idea of the hand, which is all through this passage. Don't let him go empty-handed. Make sure if you want his hand to get lighter, you got to fill it with something. You got to put something into it. Make sure it's not empty if you want it to become lighter. So again, there's this little bit of a play on what's going on here with the idea of the hand. And then finally, the Philistines do let the ark go free. They let it go, just like Pharaoh let the Israelites go free. He finally said, I've had enough. Get out of here. Okay. Now, unlike Pharaoh, they actually let it go. They watch it, but they don't try to take it back. Pharaoh tried to recover the Israelites, and it worked out so well for him. Philistines were willing to just let it go. But again, the idea of letting the ark go free in compared to letting the Israelites go free. So a lot of this Exodus imagery throughout what the author is doing here, comparing what's happened with the ark in Philistia with what happened with the Israelites in Egypt, and this idea of holding on to something you shouldn't, right? And then God sort of acting in a way to reveal himself to the Philistines, to make his glory known, to demonstrate his greatness to the Philistines, just like he did to the Egyptians. And as a result, they finally let the ark go, let it go free, and let it return to its place. So again, thinking of this in terms of the two camps, it's sort of been the underlying structure of all this, the Psalm 2 kind of structure, the two camps, right? Again, if you think in the beginning of Psalm 2, the rulers of the earth take their stand against the Lord. That's what the Philistines and their rulers did, right? We captured the ark. We've got Israel's God. We've got him captured. We've got him under our own control. We're going to take a stand against him, right? And against Israel. And God laughs at him, right? The funniest part of the story is Dagon falling on his face all the time, right? Losing his hands and his feet, or hands and head, right? right? That God just makes a laughing stock out of their God. And then as it says in Psalm 2, right, he laughs at them and then he terrifies them. That's what he does here, right? He makes sort of a laughing stock of their God, and then he terrifies the people. People are panicked, right? They're freaking out and what's going on. And he also talks about, right, the end of Psalm 2 talks about either, kiss the Son lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way, you perish. A lot of the people, the Philistines, perished. Again, we see the hardness of the human heart and its consequences, which is a commentary, just general commentary for all of us as human beings, of the danger of pride and of a hardness of heart. The Philistines, right? Part of this is the hardness of I want to keep control of the ark and what devastation it did to its people. But also, one of the really sad aspects of the story is the Philistines had the ark of God. They saw what it did to Dagon. They saw what it did to the land. They had this very clear-cut sign of the ark going back to Israel. It's Israel's God that did this to us. And they still follow their own gods, right? There's that commentary that up to this day, nobody touches the threshold of the temple of Dagon. What that means is they kept worshiping Dagon even though he lost his head and hands, right? They had this very clear sign that their God was a piece of trash, but they kept worshiping him anyway. Right? They did not turn to the God who had the real power. They kept after the God that didn't. Right? And that's unfortunately, again, part of just the human heart. Again, the hardest human heart, our willingness to change, our willingness to let go of our beliefs. Also, the Israelites, again, with the ark, they disrespected God. They paid the penalty, both with the way they treated the ark initially, which is why it got lost. Again, they treated it like a pagan object, and they lost it. And then when they got it back, they thought it was just this fun little curiosity they could play around with, right? This failure to understand the significance of the ark and of the God behind it, right? So it's a commentary both for the Philistines, but also the Israelites of the danger of pride, of the danger of the hardness of the heart, of the danger of mistreating God. Right? And then again, the idea of God's sovereign humor. So throughout this, we see God's sovereignty. We see these not limited by location, right? A lot of these gods in the ancient world were, this is my territory, I'm good here. But if you take them somewhere else, you had to wonder about how powerful they were. God goes to enemy territory, and again, he's able to be just as powerful there as he is in Israel. Right? The fact that he left Israel hasn't changed his ability to act at all. Again, the idea that he doesn't need assistance. Dagon needs help getting back up again. God is able to defeat Dagon and defeat the Philistines all by himself. He doesn't need Israel's army, right? Doesn't need any help. He's able to do what Israel is completely unable to do by himself. And so there are lessons of the Philistines. Again, hello, which God actually is doing something here, right? Which they didn't apparently pay attention to. And again, also the lesson to the Israelites. Again, don't mess with the ark, but also I'm able to beat these people if you relate to me properly. You don't have to be afraid of them. I'm perfectly capable of defeating the Philistines, but you got to quit screwing around with other gods and the other things that you're doing that allows you to be defeated. And so there's this invitation then, right? Kiss the Son, right? Submit to the Son. So this invitation both to the Israelites and to the Philistines, and therefore also to us, to make sure that we understand who this God is properly, relate to him properly, give him the respect that he deserves, so that again, it's not on the side of getting the wrath, which is what the Philistines and to some extent the Israelites got.